Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazel, and this is my controversial co-host, Abram Beener. And today we are here to talk about the state of play, as you was for 2021, and how we sort of feel about the year as a whole and the release of games from every company, third parties, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, all these fucking nonsense people, and how Abram thinks the year might be a little bit, as he's been fucking putting it, soft, which I believe translates to normal people's talk as soft. But if you want to talk about the softness of 2021 with us, you can join our Discord, the link in the description. And you can also subscribe and like the video and ring that goddamn motherfucking bell. Abram, present me with your argument. Now, I have notes to sort of discuss this a little further. But why do you think that 2021 was particularly soft for video game releases?
Because it was.
Okay.
Put the end slate up.
Expound.
No, in all seriousness, I think last year was pretty poor for a number of reasons. I think the biggest issue is that 2021 is where, in my opinion, we began to really feel COVID's effect, right? In the sense that 2020, of course, believe it or not, if when the pandemic hit, I think we're all familiar with that at this point. And while that began to scramble game development, if your game was in the stages of being ready for release in 2020, you weren't majorly affected in the sense of the bulk of that development was done. You were ready to ship a game, right? So the COVID delays happened, of course, but I think that we really started to feel them here, where the games that were not as far along started to get pushed. And we saw a lot of games get pushed. This was a year where a lot of shit slipped out of 2021 into 2022.
Making for sure even wilder.
Yeah. And putting people in positions where they were releasing games in states that were blatantly unfinished. Halo Infinite is my favorite game of the year. And one of the biggest releases, but it is blatantly and noticeably unfinished. You look at things like the GTA trilogy, completely broken, right? We look at Nintendo's entire slate, which we consider to be flagging. We looked at PlayStation's slate of being comprised 50% of definitive editions and ports. My contention is not that the year was bad, not that there weren't interesting games, because there were. As the time of you watching this, we just posted a video about sharing our top 15 games, a little overlap. There are plenty of fun games to play, but I think it's undeniable that every publisher, every platform suffered majorly this year, and it was mired in controversy, unfinished games, and continual delays that made the year pretty unsatisfying, in my opinion.
So it's interesting. I don't disagree with anything you said there. But I do think that looking at this year as an industry, as the games that were released, as the games that entered the discussion in 2021, I really don't think that that's true. I think that something like Halo Infinite being unfinished, which I definitely agree with, and that game would be better if it had co-op and Forge and all that. That's not the discussion around that game. It's true, but the discussion around Halo Infinite is, holy shit, this is the best Halo's been in years. Everyone's enjoying the multiplayer. The single player campaign is heads and shoulders up 343's best campaign. That's the discussion around that. GTA trilogy, frankly, that was a flash in the pan. No one really cares about that anymore. Not saying it was obviously it's a bad thing, and that is, I think, the biggest controversy of the year, probably in terms of an unfinished game. But those are sticks in the mud, I would say, and in what my opinion was a very quality year on the whole. Now, I do think PlayStation and Nintendo primarily were lacking, but what that gave me as opportunity to is delve into third-party companies in a way that I never had before. And I think that the third-party releases of this year are what holds it up, and why I think that, well, there's not the blockbuster titles that we're used to each year. And of course, God of War, Horizon, Breath of the Wild, those all got delayed until presumably this year if they fucking released. The things that did come out, a lot of them are some of the games that people will consider over the course of this generation, hopefully this is future projection, to be some of the best of their genre. And while that might sound a little bit surprising, I've got a list of ones that I think are pretty undeniably up there in terms of quality in their own genres. And on top of that, we got a lot of ones that are just below that, really high critical acclaim, really across the board, everyone talking about them. And that year was filled in a way that I've never experienced before with games on that level. So it might be a little bit more low key than something like 2018, which is God of War and Spider-Man and Red Dead 2 duking it out, or 2017 with Breath of the Wild and Horizon and Super Mario Odyssey. But I really don't think this year was soft. I actually think it was a more interesting year in terms of a wider variety of games being released.
Again, I don't think the year's bad. We both played a lot of interesting games.
Yeah.
But nothing pushed the industry forward this year at all. There was no Last of Us Part 2 this year.
Sure. Yes, but that's what I'm saying. It might be low key. It might be lacking those blockbusters, but I don't see that as it being soft. I see it as it being more interesting and frankly more diverse than what we're used to.
I just don't think that can be true when the year is full of as many holes as it is. Again, my contention is not that there weren't plenty of great games to play.
Sure.
But if every platform manufacturer is flagging in some respect or another, if the three big holiday games are three major shooters and Vanguard is borked, Battlefield 2042 doesn't fucking work, and Halo Infinite is unfinished, well, then that's a pretty major issue. When we're relying on games from Sony that are just rehashing what they released the prior year, there's a problem there. Now Returnal is very interesting. I think it's a very interesting game. Resident Evil Village is very polished, but it's nothing that Biohazard didn't do before it.
Yeah.
If I'm talking about a year being soft, I'm not saying that I went 12 months and didn't play anything of substance.
Of course.
But I'm saying we went 365 days with no definitive statement of where the industry is going towards, because you look at 2017, Breath of the Wild fundamentally changed how people develop their open world games. And we're seeing that.
Yeah.
Rockstar and Santa Monica Studio in 2018 moved narrative engagement forward, period. In 2019 was also somewhat of a mixed year, but we got things like Sekiro, Death Stranding, these incredibly compelling, unique experiences.
Sure.
2020, of course, Animal Crossing reinventing the social genre, so important for that year. Last of Us Part 2, again, challenging the player's relationship to narrative and mechanics.
Sure.
2021, we got It Takes Two, which is, to your point, an interesting game that would not have gotten highlight otherwise, but it is a co-op game. There's nothing inherently new about that. There's nothing that is going to push industry forward on that behalf. Returnal is not going to do it. It's a roguelike. There's plenty of roguelikes. Sure. Resident Evil Village is a great game, but it's iterating on what just happened before. My contention is not that there wasn't plenty to play. Yeah. My contention was that nothing pushed the industry forward, and at the same time, we were trying to play catch up when half our games are getting delayed, when admitted by both of us in our reviews, two of the three platform holders were operating well below par here.
Yeah.
I just don't think that makes it a good year. Plenty of interesting games, no doubt, as we described on Tuesday, but a year that is riddled with flaws nonetheless.
It's interesting because, again, as I said with your first amazing tirade that you went on, I do agree with you. I think that all this stuff is obviously subjective. We're having a conversation about our opinions on a fucking year of video games. Who really gives a shit? I mean, me, I definitely give a shit.
Right.
But when I look back at 2021, I'm not going to think, oh, there wasn't a Last of Us 2 or a God of War. I'm going to think, actually, this year had a wider variety of high quality games than I'm used to engaging with. When I look back at any of the other years, and of course, I don't think there's been a bad year for games, period, in the last few years. I think they've all been consistently good to great. But this year, actually, I found that there was more things that more people talked about. And I've got a little list here of the things that I was talking about earlier, of the games that are, well, not the blockbuster industry pushing forward titles. They're definitely some of pretty clearly the best in their genre, and I don't think it can be understated. Forza Horizon 5. I think that game changed how the industry as a whole sees racing games, as being in the game of the year conversation, being the biggest release ever for Microsoft. People who aren't into racing games giving it a try and noticing that it's very high quality. Sure. It Takes Two being probably the most polished and high fidelity co-op game of all time. And I do think probably changing the way that people see co-op games, making it more popular, winning game of the year. That's something that doesn't happen with co-op games. We're used to single player blockbuster experiences getting that award. And of course, rightly so. I love a lot of those games, but this is very different. Psychonauts 2 is one of the best 3D platformers of all time, combining storytelling and mechanics and visuals in a way that we don't usually see out of a genre that has been flagging in recent years. Super Mario Odyssey and Hat in Time really being the exceptions, but this is the AAA high fidelity, like blockbuster, quote unquote, 3D platformer that we don't get. I mean, this is something that's a little bit subjective to me, but in terms of its own genre, Life is Strange True Colors is a step above what we're used to getting in that genre. Metroid Dread is a return to form, but some will probably consider it one of the best Metroidvanias of all time. Hitman 3 really being the polished sort of extension of the stealth genre, and Guilty Gear Strive being my final one here, being one of the best fighting games of all time, being very highly acclaimed. And all these games hit that bar, and they're just the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion. These are the cream of the crop, top of their genres, but I have an entire list of other games that are on that like 85 to 90% level, which I feel like there's more of them this year, which makes the year more diverse and more interesting to talk about than a year that is headlined by games that are pushing the industry forward. Yes, but I feel like there are usually less games that are this interesting.
I just don't, I'm not sure I necessarily see where you're coming from with that list of games, because if we start from the bottom, Guilty Gear Strive, there are a bajillion Guilty Gear games that come out near yearly.
Yeah.
Arc System Works polished that formula and made it more accessible for Strive, but ultimately that is a very slow mechanical progression across a bajillion Guilty Gear games. Yeah. And this one just happened to catch in the wind.
But that's what I mean. It breaking through and being something that more people are talking about that I never heard anyone talk about Guilty Gear before this. The fact that Strive broke through and people were noticing what a high quality game this was, I think adds that to the conversation in a year in a way that makes the year more interesting to discuss. If Guilty Gear Strive doesn't come out, maybe no one notices, but the fact that it is there is a fighting game that people give a shit about, an anime fighting game that people give a shit about. That never happens.
Yeah, but it's always been played on the Evo circuit, right? And who's talking about Guilty Gear Strive right now? The people playing on the Evo circuit.
I totally understand. I'm saying is that not just the hardcore community is caring about these genres. Racing games have broken into a new sphere of engagement with Forza Horizon 5. I do think that these Arc System Works games were not as widely recognized as they are with Strive, and I think that can't be understated.
No, it can't be understated, but they're not new. None of this is new.
Hitman. I know. I'm not arguing that.
Yeah, but my thing is like that doesn't make the year strong. The fact that Guilty Gear Strive, people are paying attention to it, is because there was nothing else to pay attention to. That's kind of my contention. The year is interesting because there was no big game of importance of the year.
I agree. Yes, but I think that's actually a good thing for the year and a good thing for the industry, and not blocking out the things that are these beer tier releases. Forza Horizon 5 in any other year with The Last of Us or God of War would never be talked about in the Game of the Year conversation. The fact that we were lacking those blockbuster titles makes this year, frankly, for me, more compelling because more genres of more diverse games are being talked about on the level of Game of the Year conversation.
Well, I think the thing is, in the case of Forza, it was not given Game of the Year at the Game Awards consideration, which illustrated that the industry really did not pay attention to it the way it should have when it was Microsoft's biggest launch of the year. And
though I would say next down, IGN's Game of the Year, it did win. And obviously people were clamoring for it to be nominated for Game of the Year. People were recognizing this as obviously the most popular release of the year, the one of the highest rated games of the year. The fact that it didn't get nominated for the Game of the Awards is actually a criticism on the Game Awards, not the game itself.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
But again, that game is incredibly iterative on Forza Horizon 4.
Yeah.
I think we're talking around the same point here because I agree with you. There's plenty. I wrote an entire piece of Retroware called 2020. It was like 2021, a big year for little games, where my entire contention was because the AAA scene was flagging, indie games broke through.
Yeah.
And for me, that made the year very compelling because it gave me a chance to focus on these titles and it gave the larger community a chance to pay more attention to them. So that's a positive for sure. But it's also commentary on the fact that there was no game above it, right?
Yeah, sure.
And I think you can make this subjective argument, as you're doing quite well, that because there was no industry-defining game of the year, that you had the personal opportunity to play more different things. But at the same time, I don't think that changes the fact that this sort of lay of the land of, Nintendo didn't really do anything. Dread is fantastic. I think Dread's a top 5 Switch game, but Dread is incredibly iterative.
Yeah.
There are Metroidvanias in the indie scene that are far more inventive than Dread is, even if Dread is a lot more polished and playable.
Sure.
Microsoft's 2 biggest games go right back to their criticism of doing Gears, Forza, and Halo again.
Yeah.
PlayStation perhaps had the most interesting slate actually with Returnal and Deathloop, But outside of those two, we're going back to Ratchet and Clank. We're going back to games we just released.
Sure.
So, and again, these are all fantastic games. My contention is not that there wasn't anything to play. My contention is that the lay of the land was not as strong as any of the other years have been. That's what it comes down to for me.
Yeah, I understand that, but I would argue that there's a way for a year to be strong in terms of releases and discussion in the industry that isn't. And I think this is what I'm trying to argue, that this year is a great example of that. Is this year is strong to me, and I think will continue to be strong in retrospect, because the wider breadth of games, I think, is something that for me can't be understated, and for the industry is very important. The idea of pushing Forza and Arc System Works games and co-op games like It Takes Two and return to the 3D platformer with Psychonauts 2 is something that will continue to be influential in the industry going forward. Of course, we have yet to see that, but the fact that these games are getting that kind of critical acclaim that they wouldn't get in other years is a very strong impact on the industry, is a very strong thing for these games and these genres and diversity. This year, for the most part, looking at my list, these top games that I'm talking about were not that 3D action over the shoulder game that we're used to getting in those categories in previous years. And I think that diversity is more interesting and frankly, in my opinion, as I'm saying, makes this year just as strong and more compelling, frankly.
See, I see where you're coming from, but I just feel like you're setting up a false binary where either there's a game that pushes the industry forward, or there's space to talk about everything else.
Because but aren't you saying that as well? Because in every other year that has those big games, those are what you're focusing on making the year strong. If there's not that, then in what I'm reading for your argument, the binary is it can't be strong if it doesn't have that.
It can't be strong if it doesn't have that. I agree with that.
So there's a binary there as well.
No, and I think that the difference is this. Look at 2020. Look at the 6 games that are nominated for Game of the Year in 2020. I just pulled this up so I didn't misspeak off the top of my head. Last of Us Part 2, Animal Crossing New Horizons, Doom Eternal, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Ghost of Tsushima, and Hades. Just because Last of Us Part 2 came out didn't mean that Hades didn't get a ton of attention.
Sure.
Didn't mean that Doom didn't get a ton of attention. Didn't mean that these games weren't talked about. The reason I think you're creating this false binary is because the existence of Last of Us Part 2 did not destroy the room to have conversation around the ways that indies were pushed forward, or other genres were reinvented in terms of the sort of the survival life simulator genre with Animal Crossing, or the roguelite with Hades. Those conversations happened as strongly at the same time that the entire industry was looking at something like Last of Us Part 2 and saying, this is the future. We did it on the channel, the larger industry did it. But in the case of 2021, I feel like, yeah, we're having the same conversations we've always had, but we're not also having the conversation about here is the one or the 2 games that are a clear cut above of this is a level of artistry we have not seen before. Nothing that happened in 2021 was things we hadn't seen before. Even Hazelight, It Takes Two is an incredibly constructed game, but A Way Out did it first, right? And they needed the lessons of A Way Out to get to It Takes Two. My point is, just because a game like God of War wins Game of the Year doesn't mean we no longer talk about because Celeste was up for Game of the Year that year, and Monster Hunter World, Red Dead Redemption, things like this, right? There is space.
That is true. I would say the degree to that is where we diverge. The degree to which each year is able to allow those kind of conversations, because you're talking about Hades being the outlier 2020, Celeste being the outlier in 2018. And of course, those are great games. I love those games. I'm very glad they broke into that sphere. But pretty much everything else around those games are first-person shooters, over-the-shoulder action games. Like these are these genres that you do expect to be nominated for those awards. When we're talking about the big games of this year being Forza Horizon 5 and Psychonauts 2, these are genres that don't usually get that kind of recognition. And It Takes Two, I think, added to that genre as well. And Metroid Dread. Metroidvanias don't usually get this kind of discussion.
Maybe. I mean, Super Mario Odyssey did the Psychonauts 2 thing first, and it did it better because it actually won awards, which is not a commentary on the quality of those games, but the fact that, Mario did it and Psychonauts 2 didn't. That's just a fact, even though Psychonauts 2 is a high quality game, right? And racing is the one exception, but it's not like Forza Horizon 4 didn't sell incredibly well and have a huge player base of over 10 million players and wasn't already recognized as an amazing game, right? 5 is very iterative upon that. It's very iterative upon that.
Yeah, of course.
And Metroidvanias are holding up the indie scene. I mean, Hollow Knight is an incredibly revered game, as are a lot of these things. Dead Cells is somewhat of an indie title, and that was an enormous success for Motion Twin.
Oh yeah, of course.
I feel like what we're arriving at is this sort of nebulous thing of there being no big games so that other games got talked about. And I think that's
totally what I'm saying.
And that's a fair point, but it's undeniable that there was not that big game. And that to me makes the year soft, because you can look at any past year and say, it's not like there was one game that released in these years. There were plenty of inventive things that happened that got plenty of discussion.
Yeah.
Look at something like Death Stranding, which then got rehashed this year. But Death Stranding, a completely new lens for AAA gaming.
Completely new genre.
Active beginning of the Strand genre, right?
Yeah. We'll see how that develops. Thanks, Kojima.
Yeah, that did not win Game of the Year. That lost to Sekiro, right? But there was still conversation about that alongside Control, which is a very inventive game. Outer Worlds, Smash Ultimate. I'm speaking from a perspective of a bajillion delays, no game on par with a Red Dead or a Last of Us.
Yeah,
a flagging Nintendo slate. A lot of great games, but a lot of incredibly iterative sequels. That's what the majority of the games of this year were. Were iterative sequels. And again, they're great. We talked about our top 15 lists with very little overlap. However, that doesn't change the fact that there were a ton of delays and that there was a lot of controversy in terms of business practice and underbaked releases and poor monetization strategies. And nothing that you can point to and say, this is where the industry moved. When you can point at 2020 and say, this is where the industry went, but at the same time, look at these other 4, 5, 6 games that took their genre someplace new also. That's my only contention. That's why I think this year is, from an objective level, soft.
Well, okay. I resent that slightly, the objectivity of that, because as I've kind of put out there, I do disagree. I think there can be different avenues that a year can be considered strong. And frankly, this would be the first year I would have thought of that. In recent history, I don't know, 2019, maybe notwithstanding, because Death Stranding, I guess you can say, is like the industry pushing game of that year. But most years have that big thing. And I've always been focused very much on what's that big thing? What's the game of the year title? What's Sony doing, or the biggest Nintendo game of the generation or whatever. And because this year didn't have that, the strength, I think, came from, as I've been pushing, variety, which of course has never been lacking. The games industry is always been pretty consistent, but the availability of discussion, not being hidden underneath that, I think is another way of a year being strong. I heard more games talked about in the game of the year conversation this year, and more games talked about in general, a wider variety of genres than I ever have before. And I think that is very important, and to me makes this year very strong. I would rather look at this year and talk about a very wide variety of games in that game of the year conversation than have a game like Last of Us 2, which is one of my favorite games of all time, my second favorite game. I would rather have this. I'd rather have variety, rather have a wider variety of discussion. And I do think that element makes this year very strong for the industry.
I suppose just a difference of opinion, but I don't personally, and the only reason I used the word objective before is because it's an objective fact that a lot of stuff got delayed.
No, of course.
People relied on
iteration. I'm not going to deny all of that. However, I don't think that's the conversation about this year as a whole. Look, game delays happen every year. Of course, we got plenty of them this year, but I'd say we got even more in 2020. I'd say when you're talking about game delays, 2020 is the year you're going to focus on. Unfinished releases, yes, GTA Trilogy, but really when you think about unfinished releases, it's going to be Cyberpunk that people talk about. And these elements, of course, are part of this year, but are not the main discussion about this year. When I hear people talk about 2021, is that, man, there were a lot of great games this year, and they're all very different, and everyone has a different contention of what they're going to put as game of the year, and it's not clear cut. And I think that's much more interesting.
It's more interesting, but it doesn't show that there's much progression on the industry's level there.
Sure.
Because I do not think that there is one game that released this year, and I'm not saying like one to focus on, but I mean, no, there are no games that released this year that show me something that I hadn't seen before.
Sure.
Which is my thing, right? It's 2019, I think, is another exception because Death Stranding I don't even think is very good.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But
that's why I had a very hard time being like, well, 2019, well, maybe Death Stranding.
But we can have these conversations about how franchises were taken to new heights every year. We can have these conversations about how indies pushed the boundaries every year, as I like to do. But I can't have a conversation about how on the highest level where the forefront of the industry, how that moved at all.
Sure.
I can see how how design philosophy was changed by Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
I can see how narrative was progressed by Rockstar. I can see how Naughty Dog brought just fidelity to a new level and thematic discussion about not only the narrative themes, but also the player's relationship to the game.
Sure.
I can't say anything about that for this slate of games. And that does not make them bad at all. It makes it's a very interesting year, but I just feel like the year can't be strong without that. It can't be strong if it's not moving forward. It felt like a holding pattern, a very fun holding pattern where we got a lot of really great games, but we did get a lot of fumbles in terms of corporate strategy and in terms of game, because there were a lot of critical game delays. Sony's most important games were completely delayed.
Well, I will never deny that. Yeah.
And Nintendo's most important game, Breath of the Wild 2, was delayed. It just these things make the year lesser than, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Not necessarily less interesting, but I just don't think it's true to say because that the existence of a game that does push our medium forward means that people forget about everything underneath it.
Okay. Yeah. I do agree with that. Yeah. I think there is the possibility of that happening. However, I would say that the existence of this year and the variety and again, lack of that big game will make that discussion going into the future more vibrant, more varied. We'll now have more people talking about the co-op games like It Takes Two or the racing games like Forza Horizon 5 in that Game of the Year conversation. It's like, oh, remember in 2021 when those games were winning Game of the Year awards? Okay, let's consider Forza Horizon 6 or fucking It Takes Three. Obviously those games aren't right. Well, Forza Horizon 6 will probably be real at some point. Yes. But those games will now be in these are some of the biggest games in the industry conversation in a way they weren't able to before. And I think that going forward, this year will boost the industry, not in terms of narrative medium or gameplay mechanics, but push a wider variety of conversation in that Game of the Year conversation that will make going forward for every year that discussion much more interesting. And I think that's very exciting.
I think it's exciting, but I think that it was only exposed because there was nothing new to talk about. And the reason I say that is because
I agree.
This conversation should have happened with Forza Horizon 4, but it didn't because there were things that were actually important to the progression of the medium happening.
I know that we're on the same page here.
Yeah, but I
think that's a good thing.
No, I think it's a good thing, but it's a thing that happens by absence. This conversation happened because the year was weak. Which again,
no, I think it's because it was low key. Now I think that's where I want to hammer in on. The lack of blockbusters is, of course, an obvious thing of this year. Sony not putting their fucking front foot forward is a big part of this year, and I do think that it makes me criticize them, but it doesn't make me criticize the industry, because that hole that doesn't have a Last of Us or God of War, I think, was filled by a lot more interesting things, as I've been saying, a wider variety of things that was maybe not filled to the fucking top, but I don't think that the gap that is left by there wasn't this big Sony thing, frankly, doesn't mean that the industry is not still on a track to have a wider variety of more interesting games.
But I get where you're coming from, but can you point to any games from this year that gained this exposure but used that opportunity to do something that was truly new?
Sure. Yeah.
Because I can't. That's my point. Forza Horizon 5 broke through, but it broke through by doing the same thing it's done for a long time. It just happened to have eyes on it.
Yeah.
right? I think about the success of a game like Hades breaking through.
Mhm.
Hades didn't break through because there was a dearth of bigger games to take away from it.
Sure.
It broke through because it was on that level.
Yeah,
because it did something inventive and polished enough that it deserved to be talked about next to Last of Us Part 2.
Naturally, yeah.
It wasn't, oh, there's nobody here, I'm going to be here instead. And that's my feeling, because it was a year of iteration. And there's nothing wrong with iteration.
Sure.
But there's nothing daring about it either. And that's kind of my thing.
Yeah.
And that's why I consider the year to be weak, because there was no innovation. It was all iteration. And that's the difference I draw. And again, I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who played a ton of fantastic games this year.
Yeah,
but I'm talking from a macro level. I think it was a weak year.
Yeah. Frankly, we're spinning our fucking wheels at this point. We're not going to come to a common ground on this, and you know what? That's okay. I think we were able to have a very interesting conversation, and I think what we'll be able to see going forward is this year coming up, lots of big games. I mean, I don't think that's deniable. Of course, lots of big games. The game of the year conversation is going to be crazy this year, mostly because a lot of those games were pushed out of 2021.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see going forward how this year's biggest games, which are in franchises from companies that are doing that industry pushing forward, if they still fall in the shoes of that iteration. Breath of the Wild 2, sequel to Horizon, sequel to God of War, sequel to Splatoon. Like, these are the biggest games this year, and I'm going to enjoy the fuck out of all of them. But they do that. They do that iteration, but on that bigger scale. It'll be interesting to see at the end of the year if any of these games are that interesting to fighting, and if even with all these franchises from these biggest companies, if this year, at least through your eyes, is also soft because it's lacking that innovation. It's focusing more on iteration. That's a discussion to have, I think, fucking 1 year's time. Let me check my clocks and watches.
Yeah, I don't really know what else to add. I think it was a very interesting conversation, and I think it was also probably a necessary one, because I think we're basically on the same page. But I think it still took us to an interesting place nonetheless. And I think here's what people should do. If you agree with me, like the video. If you disagree, dislike the video. And then as an audience member, look at the ratio and see who's winning.
Can't do that anymore. Do you not remember?
I remember. I remember.
Oh, I see. Oh, you're really fucking me over with that one.
No, but for real, I think, again, this was a year that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's just a year that I felt it just happened. And I think
I agree.
I think you're making a really good point about 2022. I think that the games that are most interesting next year are things like Elden Ring or Starfield. Oh, fuck it. Who cares? Elden Ring or Starfield, those big new IPs.
Yeah.
Or the opportunity for the sort of seeds sowed by a Breath of the Wild to pay off with a Horizon sequel that feels like it does again push open world games forward by taking those lessons somewhere else. Or maybe Nintendo does it again in-house, but we'll see. I just think that there's a lot more opportunity for, at the highest level, the industry to actually do something fresh.
Yeah.
But also to release a Last of Us remake. So it's all just a hellscape, isn't it?
Oh God. That's gonna be a fun release cycle. People talking about that game. Frankly, it's not gonna be as controversial as maybe we're thinking it's me. It's gonna release. It's gonna look great. It's gonna probably be a great game.
Yeah, I don't see why there'd be any controversy. I think it'd be kind of neat, if completely necessary. So
yeah. Well, we'll see you guys when The Last of Us remake comes out.
No videos stopping
until then. Let's watch Tag that same year. 2018 was a fucking strange time.
Wow. Tag doesn't have a really good cast. Let me tell you something. Tag has John Cena written all over it.
It don't got no Cena though. So I don't know what you want me to tell you.
Why don't you tell me that John Cena is in Tag?
I can't do it. I refuse.
That's what I want you to do.
I refuse.